We're going to make a classic white dough that can be used for both pizza and French bread. It's essentially the same ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. The salt is 2% of the flour weight. This is instant yeast, 0.5% of the flour weight. So that's going to go in. We call it instant yeast because it dissolves instantly as soon as you add water to it. I'm going to stir all these dry ingredients together. I've buffered the yeast and the salt from each other in the flour, buried in there. And now I'm going to add the water. And the water is 67 to 68% of the flour weight for this dough. And I'm going to start mixing by hand. Now it seems like this dough is pretty thirsty. It's sucked up all that water, but some of the water is still in the bottom, and the dough feels pretty wet to my hands. So I think that we're going to be able to pick up the rest of this loose flour as I need it. I'm going to put a little bit of dusting flour on the bench, just in case it's too sticky. I don't want it to stick to the bench. You can see that in the bowl, I've got still a little bit of flour left, a little bit of dough stuck in there. So I'm going to scrape that out, get it all into the dough, and then I'm going to continue to mix it by hand. And we'll call the stage the kneading stage. We're going to knead the dough by hand. And to do that, I'm just going to kind of turn it. We're going to knead it and fold it into itself and keep turning it over. The turning over is what starts to develop the gluten. We have at this stage what we call a coarse, shaggy dough, because it kind of looks like a shag rug. You see, it's not smooth yet. The gluten is not developed because if I pull it, you can see that it doesn't hold together, but you can see little threads of gluten and protein trying to develop. So it's probably going to take about 3 minutes of hand kneading to get this to where I want it to be. What we're going for now is to go from shaggy dough to a smooth, supple, tacky dough. And by tacky, I mean instead of sticking to my hands, it will peel off my finger like a Post-it note. In fact, what we can do at this point is just at this coarse, shaggy stage, we can actually just let it sit. We don't have to keep kneading it. We can just let it rest for about 3 or 5 minutes. And then when we come back to it, the gluten will have already been kind of developed and primed, and it will just need to be organized through additional kneading. So let's let this rest. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this dough with a bowl so it doesn't get a skin. And we'll come back to it in just a couple of minutes, and we'll continue the kneading process. Okay, so this dough's been resting for a few minutes. In the meantime, I took advantage of that time to clean my hands, because if you have dough stuck to your hands, then it will start to pull dough off of the dough ball itself. So we don't want to get more on your hands. But I'm going to lift the bowl, and you can see this dough has been sitting here. It's still a little bit coarse and shaggy, but it is definitely developed. The gluten has developed because while it's been sitting here, the gliadin and the glutenin have been bonding. So this dough is primed and ready to be finished off so that it can be put away for fermentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch modes here. Instead of using flour, I'm going to lift this dough and replace where I had the dough rising. I'm going to add a little bit of oil, just a teaspoon or so of olive oil. It could be vegetable oil, but any kind of oil, because this, and we're going to create an oil slick. This will give us a slick surface, and it's not enough oil to really be considered an ingredient in the dough, but it will be very functional for us because it will allow us to lift the dough without it sticking to the bench. And then we're going to do something called a stretch and fold, and we're going to do a few of these. So stretch and fold is you press the dough down and you stretch it, and you can still see that it's very coarse here, but watch what happens after we do a couple stretch and folds. We stretch it about 2/3 of the way over, stretch it from the other side, bring it back this way, give it a quarter turn, stretch it, fold it over, and stretch it and fold it over so that you've got all 4 sides stretched and folded, and then put it seam side down, back in the oil slick. We're going to let it rest again for just a few seconds, and again, when I'm in that resting mode, I like to cover it, just so that the skin doesn't get dry out and get a little bit of a scaly quality to it. So this dough's been resting, and you can see that it's a lot stronger than initially, because the glutenin and the gliadin have been bonding, and now they've just sort of formed up. They're just ready to be organized, and that's what's going to happen with these stretch and folds. I'm going to cut off a little piece of this dough just to show you how much stronger it is than it was before we broke for the stretch and fold. And stretch it out, and you can actually even see a thin membrane forming that we call the window pane. There is our window pane. Now you don't have to do a window pane test every time you make dough, but look how strong that window pane is. It's even holding my finger up. That tells us that the gluten has developed. So we've accomplished the 3 objectives of mixing, which is distribution of ingredients, the activation of the yeast, and the development of the gluten. But I want to smooth it out a little bit more, so I'm going to do one more stretch and fold. I'm going to stretch the dough to kind of smooth out the surface so that you can see that this is no longer a coarse, shaggy dough, but a firm, supple, easy to it's like putty almost, and strong. We know that we have gluten development. So at this stage, the mixing is over. We can actually take this to the fermentation stage. The 3rd stage of the dough process is fermentation. Now, you could either put it back in this bowl, but since this one still has a lot of flour in it, I've got a clean bowl. We're going to use one of these mixing bowls. I'm going to add just a splash of oil, or you could also use pan spray, just so that the dough comes out easily. I'm going to grease the bowl a little bit, and I'm going to lift this dough and put it in the bowl to rise. Now, it will double in size eventually, but we don't want it to happen real fast. We're not in any rush. This has to be made the day ahead of when you're planning to bake, and then you can hold it for up to 2 or 3 days, maybe even 4 days afterwards if you take it to the refrigerator and chill it down a few minutes after you mix the dough. We'll let this dough have about 15-20 minute head start for the yeast to begin to wake up, to ferment the grains, to digest the sugars and create carbon dioxide and alcohol, and it's going to cause the dough to rise. The gluten network will trap that carbon dioxide, and that's what causes it to rise. I'm going to cover this bowl with plastic wrap. I'm going to put it in the refrigerator in a little bit, and we're just going to let it sit there and do its work overnight. The fermentation, a first stage of fermentation, will take place overnight. Then tomorrow we'll divide it into dough balls or into pieces for baguettes, and we'll turn them into bread and pizza.